born in Burnside, and so I suppose I was destined to go to gravitate north in some way. My mother was particularly keen on the Redlegs, and Dad had an interest, but Mum was keen, and I think that's where it really began. Just from casual conversation, I can't remember the first game I went to. My father said he took me to a grand final involving North Adelaide, which would, if that was the case, it'd be 1950 or something, and I find that I got no recall. But Norwood was always in the blood. I played at school, at underage at Pulteney Grammar School, 3 or 4 years, then played for the Old Scholars when I left, because I went to Saltash Business College after a period at Pulteney, and academically modest career nil, and and I was working very soon after I finished school in 1963 and went straight to work. So I was at, and of course I was exposed straight away. But my best mate at Pulteney Grammar School was Ian Jervis, who was Laurie Jervis's son, and Ian's son Luke is one of my godsons, and so I was growing up in the at Pulteney, and my mateship with Ian, I was often around at the Jervis residence, and that meant that there was always football conversation, and there was often football visits. Curly would drop by, or Bob McLean would drop by, and there was always football conversation. So I was exposed to it very early. Ian was a Glenelg supporter and I was a Norwood supporter, so we alternated for a period. I'd go to see the Beige one week and he'd come with me to see the Redlegs the following week. They were during those school years. And after playing football of a morning, we'd have a shower wherever we were and then head off to the football in the afternoon. I can remember being outside the old stand on the parade listening to Alan Killigrew giving one of his hot gospel addresses, which a few of the kids would be outside and listen to him roaring inside. And I remember that well. Yeah, I remember that well. And of course, I was called Bill at school after Bill Wedding. I had a winter god, who was Bill Wedding, and a summer god, who was Les Favell. And I would follow Bill all the way, even to an embarrassing stage. If you saw him at the showgrounds, he'd be hanging around with Ron Neabone or something, you'd follow them around, you're sort of, you're just in the presence of greatness. And so I followed Bill's career very, very closely and got to know him, and how lucky I was, what a wonderful, wonderful man he was. And I can remember those days. And of course, when it ended up in my professional life and writing Norwood's history for the centenary in 1978, I got very close to Wally Miller, very close, and he drove the whole history of Red and Blue Blooded and Men of Norwood, which we republished in 1992 when the Crows came in, because South Australian football history could never be the same. And so I've had a very, very close contact with Norwood over the years, and many of its personalities. Oh, I could probably run off the 1960 side probably, for Johnson, Stevens, Vivian. No, Vivian may not have been. Brian Wills would have been on the half-forward flank. Buster Gordon in the middle probably, or Darryl Koch perhaps. Certainly the half-back line, the famous one of Miller, Kneebone, Inglis. Harrison in the back pocket with Aish, Johnson in the other back pocket. And I always used to have a laugh when I was at the Advertiser with Gordon Schwartz, who was 19th or 20th man, was Harley Swanbury. And it was one of the great trivia questions of all time, who was 20th in the grand final. Well, I began professionally at the News in 1963, and I had stints in Melbourne in 65 as the News representative, and then I worked on the Herald in Melbourne in 68, 69, the afternoon broadsheet, which of course the very fact that there's an afternoon paper is significant these days. The fact it was a broadsheet was even more remarkable. That had a circulation of over 500,000. And at the height, when they landed on the moon in 69, 1.2 million papers a day came out of 44 Flinders Street. Over 600,000 Suns in the morning and 500,000 Heralds in the afternoon. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. So anyway, I went overseas and worked for Australian Associated Press in London out of 85 Fleet Street, which I noticed to my horror last year when I was in London to godson's wedding. 85 Fleet Street is no longer, or the building isn't. That's when I began my cricket career, really, because I was assigned to the Ian Chappell's 1972 Tour of England. And I was very fortunate. It was a fantastic 3 years I had doing sport in Europe. I did the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, the Olympic Games in Munich, 2 French tennis championships, the Famechon-Saldivar World Featherweight Fight in Rome, you know, the Eisenhower Cup in Madrid. It was a fantastic time to be there. And in 1972, at one of the test matches late in the year, of that tour, I think it was at Headingley, and Merv Agars was over. And he was then sports editor of the Advertiser, and he offered me the job at the Advertiser. Would I like to come back to Australia, and would I like to come to the Tiser? And there were no assurances, of course. Keith Butler was still the senior cricket writer. And I said, yes, I'd like to. I had 3, I couldn't have done a 4th winter in England. I just couldn't have. And so I came back, and it was critical. It was professionally, it was a critical decision, a smart decision by me, and I was very grateful to Merv. Because Merv, along with Gordon Schwartz and Laurie Jervis, were the sort of the real mentors for me growing up at the start and really right through. And of course, he played for Norwood, as he played for West Torrens. And of course, he played for Australia in tennis during the war. Yeah, he was just a wonderful, warm human being, and he was tremendously supportive. He was sort of, I suppose, nearly a surrogate father to a lot of young journos. There's no doubt about that. And I was very close to his son Mark, who died tragically young, and I still see his younger son David, who's now in Singapore, so still in touch with David. He was a wonderful man, and I got strong memories of listening to the Rossiter football show on a Thursday night, of course, when Gordon would announce who was the footballer of the week. You know, I was hanging in there every week that K.A. Wedding would be footballer of the week, because there would be more editorial copy would be assured. And so it's strange, you know, sort of listening to those journos and reading those journos, then growing up and sharing in their lives, professionals and personal lives, really was a great privilege. And I consider myself very fortunate. And they all had influences. I mean, Gordon and Merv were both very caring and thoughtful operators in what can be a pretty rowdy and rough world, as you know. Particularly in the old days when the news and the Advertiser were it was important that we did compete. And of course, then I ended up having the relationship with Alan Sheil, of course. As a football and cricket writer. We celebrated his 80th birthday just the other day. And so, you know, I've been lucky from that point of view, to observe them professionally and then to share with them in their professional lives. As I said, I had a very modest academic record. I wasn't good in the school years, and I regret some of that now. But I always did have a keen interest in sport and a keen interest in history and English, and that served me well. And it continues to serve me well. And perhaps I certainly should have been more attentive in other areas, but that's the way it goes. You know, there's no time for regrets now. You know, at this age, you just make the most of what you got. And I've had a wonderful working life. Laurie Jervis's advice from the absolute word go was, be a journalist before you're a sports writer, and that's sage advice. Because you do learn the disciplines of journalism. I mean, I covered police rounds. I mean, some horrendous stories. I did a lot of the Beaumont stuff when Gerard Croisset was here for the famous excavation. the Truro murders and all sorts of things over the years. So I did a lot of police reporting and court reporting. And I wasn't particularly interested in politics in the early days. I think you become more politically aware as you get older. So I was never interested in politics. I loathed the financial side of it, you know. It was absolute purgatory having to do the wool sales and stuff like that. But they're all the disciplines you learn of doing the police rounds, court rounds, as a copy boy. I mean, I was possum on the Sunday Mail, and it taught me a tremendous amount, you know, how to lay out a page, etc., etc. And I can still, of course, possum provided certificates of various colours worth certain points, which you could cash in for children's books. And I can still remember Peter Noy 6 of Jepp's Cross. He would have had the most astonishing children's library. The number of that he got different coloured certificates for his short stories, for his riddles, for his puzzles. It was extraordinary. Peter Noy 6, Jepp's Cross. Isn't it bizarre what you recall? But the disciplines of being on possum, you know, learning layout, what type faces to use, and all those sorts of things. As a copy boy, we would ride our bikes from North Terrace to West Terrace to the Bureau of Meteorology to get the weather map, for the weather map that would appear in the paper, you know, later that day. You know, we had to go down to get the map. And so we rode our bike faithfully down North Terrace to West Terrace and picked it up from the Bureau and brought it back. I mean, they were very simple days, as you know. You know, it was, but tremendously rewarding, tremendously rewarding. And I still believe that probably afternoon newspapers and agencies provide the best training of all for a journalist. Well, there's now no afternoon papers at all. Agencies have diminished again, sadly, but I'm very grateful for the training I got there. As I grew into it with contacts, oh yeah, and you have to be resourceful. I can't remember Laurie or Merville Gordon. I think, Neil, to a great degree, it's based on personality. The more I think about this, and I think you'd understand that better than most, that if you are a communicator in a communications industry, a lot of it comes down to personality and trust. The famous story of, just to illustrate that, I was sitting in the office one night, it would have been 1973. Phone rang, and it's, hello Mike, it's Wally Miller here. I've got one thing to say and that's all. Robert Odie has finished as coach of Norwood. Bang. So it happened to be Pembroke's, what do you call them, speech night at the theatre on Kensington Road at Marriotteville, the Odeon, I think, or I can't remember, but near the Marriotteville, the turn off to Tasmore. And so here we were at 8 or 8:30 at night, and early, I mean, the deadlines weren't too bad in those days, probably 11 o'clock deadline, first edition. So I had this story. I did a holding piece saying that he was sacked, and that but I had to find Otie. So I got out to the theatre. You know, I found out where he would be at the speech night, and as I went down one aisle, he saw me coming and came out the other aisle, and so it was a bit of that, because Robert, I respected Robert, but he was difficult. He was a difficult individual, and but you know, his football knowledge was extraordinary, because mainly coming from Dad. But yeah, so then I got back, and the pure excitement then of being able to break that story. So you're out on the stone. These, of course, were the hot metal days. And that sort of terminology is unfamiliar to people today. And so you're out with the typesetters at 1 o'clock in the morning for the next edition, that's the big edition, at 1 or 1:30. And breaking the story like that. So that was Wally. He respected me and trusted me, and that was apart from the fact that he knew I was a Norwood man. Funniest one was that is I coached the under-15s at Pulteney Grammar School for 9 years, and that included the Aish boys. And I must confess that at one stage I got wind of the fact of Michael training at West Torrens, or West Adelaide, or West Torrens I think it was, funnily. And so I just had to mention that to Wally, just quietly in dispatches, and he moved on that pretty quickly, it must be said. Yeah, and what an extraordinary individual. I mean, I still remember him playing, and I still remember I always used to tease him about it. The shirt front of Brian Livesey was the biggest I've ever seen. And I've seen some biggies over the years, but his shirt front of Brian Livesey was extraordinary. So, and he would always sort of just, he would acknowledge it. He would acknowledge it. It was a big bump. He was a good player, really good player. I mean, the tragedy of that, to have played. I mean, there's so many wonderful Wally stories. I mean, even the fact that he played, his first game was 1958, I reckon, after the 57 grand final the next year, and he paid for his way into the ground because, you know, that's what you did. He hadn't been told any different, so he paid his whatever it was, and got in and, you know, stripped and off he went. I mean, the simplicity and the honesty, and a sad life. I mean, but did you ever hear him complain? Never. And he was just, I don't think I've known a more admired administrator in any sport, and I don't know if I've known a better one, administrator in any sport. Yes, I mean, his passing was incredibly sad. I had the privilege of doing the eulogy at his funeral, and then did the memorial service on the ground, which was interesting, and some beautiful speaking then, you know, from Neil Craig and Barmy and the rest of the Gags. Gags was very impressive, as was Michael Oates, and Mike Taylor, of course. And his influence on those young men was extraordinary. And of course, they have continued to contribute to the game enormously as players, as administrators, as commentators, and coaches. So, you know, the influence goes on. The fact that he, devised the kicking for kids, you know, to develop programs to encourage children to play the game and how they went about it. Yeah, he had an enormous influence on the evolution of the game in South Australia and, in fact, nationally. Well, they were very, very close. And that little triumvirate of Miller, Barman, Wynne, Johnny Wynne, or 2-8, of course, as he's known, he rang Wally every Thursday for year upon year upon year. And there was an emptiness in Winnie's life once Wally left. But wonderful memories. And there was a few of us sort of were a little disappointed by the number at the memorial service for Wally, but as Wynne pointed out, he shouldn't have been, but he was in his 80s. Because when I started on the news, of course, there were 4 editions of the news every day. The City and State was out by 5 to 11, the One Star at 5 to 2, the 2 Star at 5 to 3, and the Red Spot at 10 past 4. So, I mean, you had all those editions within the day. And then for the mornings, of course, as I said before, with the Odie story, that, you might have a first edition closed by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock perhaps, I can't remember what it was now. You're always pushed for a bit more, like Merv when he was sports editor was always pushing for more space. Because there was a little bit of the afternoon paper could give plenty of space to sport. The morning broadsheet, or particularly the mentality at the Advertiser at the time, was reluctant, and because it's driven by advertising, of course. And so Merv was always fighting for more space. It was interesting. And that's why I said that perhaps that the afternoon papers, and not perhaps, definitely afternoon papers and agencies were the best training, because you had to work speedily and accurately I wasn't the fastest rider by any means. In fact, I was Brian Mosser, who's now no longer with us. There was I took over from him at the Sydney Morning Herald as cricket writer. We were two of the slowest at the last out of the press boxes at Test match time, but some can write very well very quickly. Others can write well but take time. And but yeah, I mean today, it's all for the moment. It's all instant, and it's opinion rather than analysis. And it's opinion rather than just recording the facts. And that's where the problems arise. And that's why there's, I think, quite a deal of tension now between elite sportsmen and the media people. Well, I'd had 3 years in Melbourne at the Age, in between. And I wrote football right through then with Ron Carter was the head man, and Percy Beams had finished. Jeff Slattery. We were pretty handy side of writers then. And Neil Mitchell had taken over as sports editor. And he allowed his writers tremendous license. Because you're doing, covering a match on Saturday for a match report that appeared on Monday. So, that it had to be a different approach. And that was 81, 2 and 3 I was there, and covered one grand final. Was Hawthorn and Essendon. I think it was about a 97-point margin. And you're suddenly confronted on a Sunday with 100 paragraphs to lead the broadsheet page on the grand final with a 97-point margin. What do you do? So it was professionally a real challenge. But once I got to Sydney, Eric Beecher was then editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, and he said to me, this paper was built on two things. It was built on its writing on politics and on cricket. And that's what you must remember. So no, really there was no writing on football after that. In more recent years, I was an ambassador for the Sydney Swans, and worked on not so much a website, but on it's a little thing called online forum called Bloods for Life for former players and one thing or other. And that's been interesting because when I was at the Age, I covered the whole drama of the move from South Melbourne to Sydney, and the pain and the angst and the anguish of all of that. It was a fantastic football story. There was a lot of going on in those days. That's when Randall McDonald and the Collingwood explosion. It always tumultuous. Victorian football was always tumultuous, and the AFL is, carries the tradition grandly. It's always tumultuous. So I missed. But to be perfectly frank, I grew weary at the end, from a journalistic point of view, on a cold Tuesday night in Melbourne, getting to the door and couldn't get past a doorman, waiting, for an 18-year-old kid to come out and tell you nothing, basically. And in those days, the 60s, 70s, or certainly the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, from what I can glean from others, there wasn't that sort of appreciation of the need to have a good rapport. There were certainly no media liaison officers and things like that in place at that stage. That came later. And so that became, if I could still write not that I can follow it now because it's changed so dramatically, I often think now, how would I manage to cover a game when I look down on it? Because in times gone by, as you know, it was so clearly structured that you could follow the moves and the strategies and the tactics being employed, and who was being brought off for whom and why, and where he was being moved and why. But of course, that's not possible anymore. you've got to be very smart to be able to pick up. And so the analysis, nowadays you've got to really find someone who's very good in their analysis, who understands the subtleties of it all. So it's more unpredictable than it ever was. So yeah, no, it's interesting. So, but if I could still just cover the game, I would enjoy that. Even if I would struggle to pick up the subtleties of the strategies. That goes right back to when I was first in Melbourne in the 1960s. So I didn't just embrace the Swans. I was, in that context, I was with them at South Melbourne. And in fact, in 1965, when I was the cadet for the Adelaide News in Melbourne, sitting in an adjacent office was Austin Robertson, who was the cadet for the Daily News in Perth, and but at the same time playing at full forward for South Melbourne. So I would go with him just to support him on a Saturday, go to the footy with him. And we ended up in the rooms after, and mixing with the Bob Skiltons and the Elkin Rileys and the Johnny Herriots of the world, and Graham John, who has a magnificent tenor voice, and I did a bit of singing. And he and I would occasionally have a duet in the rooms. I mean, they didn't win too many games, South Melbourne, of course, in those days, but they always were. They were a good club, and so that's where my relationship with the South Swans began. And so then, because I had some profile in the cricket world, and Richard Collis, the long-term chairman, who's had an enormous influence on the Swans' development, he got me on board as an ambassador, and once a year we would have a cricket lunch at the football, and his hero was Richie Benno. So I would ask Richie to come, and I would interview Richie and a few others, luminaries, Bob Cowper and a couple of others, at once a season. So yeah, Richard had an enormous impact, and that's where it came. But my affection for the club goes right back to the 60s, when Ocker was at full forward, because he's no longer with us now either. Because I've been away from Adelaide since 1981, and but the first one came about because of the centenary in 1978, and Wally, when I came back in 73 and was writing, I wrote footy from 73, and of course I was on World of Sport with Gordon and Merv and all the boys, and for a while hosted the Big Replay on Channel 7 at night. So I had a close association. They were pretty hectic Saturdays, those, doing the under-15s in the morning, and you imagine the kids used to get heaps of thrown at them because I was coaching them, and they could give me heaps as well. And then go back after that, do the Big Replay, do the kids in the morning, league game, Big Replay, and home. And then to do the match report for Monday, so she was pretty full on, but wonderful. It was a wonderful time in my life. So we were very conscious of the centenary, and so Wally came to me and said, could I or would I? And I said, love to. And it was wonderful. It really was. It was. And the privilege, as I look back now, the privilege of speaking with, most of them, pretty well all were alive, all the great ones, I can still remember going up to Stirling and seeing Wacker Scott and just listening. He was the most charming man. And he told stories of Topsy Waldron and all of these, from the very, very early days. You could remember Topsy as an old man coming into the rooms and his eyes filled with tears if Norwood had had a win. And Topsy was a fairly contentious character. So yeah, we got into it, and it was a joy. And Wally really let me go with it. The way we did it, I'm a great believer in the people make the club. And so the book would always, and pretty well everything I've done in cricket writing as well, it focuses on the people and their lives, because I think that's what the consumer is most interested in. We all know they've got the capability to play it at the highest level and play it extremely well, but what makes them go? What makes them tick? So it was a privilege really to think of them all. Percy McCallum was still going, John Marriott. We got a picture of all the Magarey medalists together. All the oldies with Michael Aish, and just wonderful, really wonderful. I don't think you ever go away from it fully. I updated the baggy green history, the history of the baggy green cap last year. I did it with Michael Fay. We first did it in 15 years ago when women's cricket wasn't significant, so we've updated it, including women's cricket prominently, and just updating it generally. The 2008 sort of focused on Michael Clarke taking off his helmet to make sure that he had his cap on when he got his first 100 in Bangalore, now Bengaluru. This time I swung it around to Labuschagne. What for a boy who arrived in Australia couldn't speak English, and whose baggy green he was thought about when he was growing up was the South African cap. And so that was an interesting juxtaposition and sort of freshen up and make it more. So I'm still fiddling around, and I've got some work with Rick McCosker to do in the near future. So I think probably by the nature of the job, they'll probably always have a keyboard there, but the relief is no deadline. I think that's what's most wearing is the deadline. And that's what, in the end, cruelled you. I think you'd work hard, there'd be a morning paper, so you work till although the deadlines, of course, have come further and further forward. But you do a pace, you might have a 45 or 50 pars on the back, and then they say, well, I want 20 for the front, and you do 20 for the front. So you file that and you check the office, all clear, and they say, and what have you got for tomorrow? And you just think it's endless. It's endless. And I think in the end, as you get older, it just becomes too much. I admire the young ones now. I think it's astonishing the demands on them, to write well, to be able to report, often to have to edit. And it brings another dimension to multi-skilling, and the best are very, very good. Yeah, very much so. I follow them as closely as I can. I'm still in touch with the Aish boys as friends, of course, who I coached. Most of my under-15s now are in their 60s, which is fairly disconcerting. In fact, I had dinner with a couple of them on this trip to Adelaide. But I think what that does do also, though, is illustrate the joy of sport and the importance of those contacts and the people in your life through sport. And there's no doubt that exposure to young people in sport does help to keep you young and vibrant. You listen to the way they think, listen to what they're listening to, what they're talking about. If you didn't have that, you could get pretty old pretty quickly, and very set in your ways. And I am a traditionalist, but I've learned, particularly when it comes to cricket, I really do struggle with franchise cricket and all those aspects of it. Not so much because of the way it's being played, it's more the fact that it monopolises the conversation of the game. Yet suddenly when you had a test series like last summer with India and look forward to an Ashes series, everything's okay again. But I defy anybody to follow cricket in its entirety these days and to have any authority, to know with any authority exactly what's going on and who's playing where and why. And I think they're going to have to be very careful, the administration. I think it's gone too far. It's devalued it to a large degree, and it's devaluing the standards as well. And a lot of the game's great virtues are suffering as a consequence, in my view. But the pure stuff is still pure. But I think the cricket community has to work hard to maintain that and maintain the purity of it. And that's going to be a battle, because the money and the franchise really has taken over. But yeah, no, I take a close interest in. I keep an eye on Norwood's scores. Haven't seen them play for a while. And it's interesting that when we did Men of Norwood in '92, and I realised then that I didn't see McIntosh play. I mean, it's extraordinary. By the time I left, and his whole celebrated career followed. Of course, I met him, and the enigmatic character that he is, and interviewed him for the book, which was a joy. Wally said, "Good luck," and so yeah. No, I take a keen interest in them and with the Swans, and I will continue to, I hope, for a long time. And I certainly watched Norwood in their grand final. They're a bit unlucky there. But they've been a pretty successful side over a long period, and the character of the club and the characters of the club, you know, it's still a talking point. It's a great football club, and of course, in more recent years, speculation: will they eventually go into the AFL? Will it happen? I doubt it will now. There was a time when it might well have. As Wally was in the vanguard of that operation as well. But yeah, so somebody said the other day, should there not be 20 teams and 2 conferences of 10, and what might that lead to? So it's hard to foresee, Neil, but I'll always be a man of Norwood.